What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode we are going to be going over advanced death and dying in our first-person shooter tutorial series. So before in the series we covered the ability to die and then respawn at a given location. And that's all well and good, we still want to do that. But we had no actual dying animation, and really all we did was teleport the character back to that respawn location. Now, while that may work for some game modes, we also want a way to actually be defeated in our game, maybe have to retry our checkpoint, or actually have to wait for a counter to respawn like in a multiplayer scenario. And that's what we'll be covering today. So you can see I have my traps here. All these multicolored spikes are just traps. So basically if I run into them, I will lose health. I do have a shield and health system in the top left corner, so you'll see the shields go down first. Once the shields are down, the health will go down. Once my health reaches 0, I die and I am defeated. Now at this point we have to figure out what we want to do from here, such as respawn on a timer, or like I said, restart the checkpoint, whatever it is we want to do. We'll go into that in another episode. Today what we want to do is make sure that once we are defeated, we play an animation like this, and we stop any unnecessary actions from being able to occur while the character is dead. So for example, right now, I haven't done it yet, I can still move while I'm dead. My shield still recharged while I was dead, and I can actually still shoot while I'm dead. All these things should be stopped. We're going to go through one by one and make sure that we can only do the certain things that we want to do while we're dead, which could potentially be look around. If you want to be able to look while you're dead, some games will let you do that. Before we do hop into this episode, if you want to get caught up in the series, I'll link you to the entire playlist right here in the top right corner. You can check out everything we've done to date, such as interacting with these doors, shooting our weapons, picking up other weapons, and reloading. Alternatively, if you don't care about all that, you can check out this episode right here, which is the previous episode on death and respawning in this series. We are going to be expanding upon that a little bit today, so I would recommend that you watch that before you watch this one, just so that you know exactly where we're coming from. With that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. First things first, I want to go into my code, my FPS tutorial character.h. I'm scrolling down to my variables, and I'm going to my booleans, and I'm just adding one called isDead, and it's as simple as this. It determines if the character is dead. Made it a U property, edit anywhere, blueprint read write with a category of health so that we can access it in the blueprint. After we make this boolean isDead, we can go and make sure that we set it to all the expected default values. So in our FPS tutorial character.cpp, in the constructor, where we set all of our default values, I've made sure to set isDead to be false. Since this character was just created, they have not yet died, so we want to make sure that isDead is false. Now, earlier in the series, we had a function called die and a function called respawn. For the purposes of this episode, I've commented out the line where we call respawn in the die function, because we may not want to just respawn the character right away. And specifically to show you guys how everything is working, how it looks here, I don't want to force the character to teleport to their respawn location and reset their variables. So I've just commented out this line in the die function where we call the respawn function. That way we don't do any of the respawn logic. This is just temporary. Of course, we are going to fill out the respawn function fully, but specifically I want to cover the dying section today. And so I've commented out respawn, and I've also set isDead to be true within the die function. If the character is calling the die function, they have died, so isDead is true. Now, even though we're not working with respawn today, we don't want to forget this, so when we respawn and we reset all of our variables, the character is no longer dead. So we should make sure that isDead is being set back to false in the respawn function. Everything else you see in these functions is exactly the same as it has been throughout the rest of the series, so you don't have to worry about changing anything else in there. Alright, I'm going to scroll back up to the top, and I'm actually going to go into the engine real quick and into the animation blueprint for the character. This is where we've set up all of our different animations. In here, I've added a new state called death. So I right-clicked in my state machine, clicked add state, called it death. Inside of this state, I have a death animation, which I've made sure that I don't loop. It only plays once, and then the character gets stuck in that animation. This is what my death animation looks like. And that is what you see in first-person mode when my character runs out of health. Now, to get to this state and to actually play that animation, all we need to check for is our new boolean. So right now, I only have a transition rule from idle to death. And I just check for the isDead boolean off of our character reference. We use our character reference for pretty much all of our other state machine transitions. For example, reload, we check to see if the character reference is reloading. So basically the character that owns this animation blueprint is reloading. And in this case, we're checking to see if the character that owns this anim BP is dead. If they are dead, we want to go into the death state. Now doing this, we will only be able to go to the death state from the idle state. So you probably don't want that, because if we do that, we will be able to stay in the walking or moving state. We can die and we can keep walking until we release the button. When we return to idle, then we will go into the death animation. I'd recommend that you add a transition rule from any state to the death state so that you can transition from every other state in the game to the death state. It pretty much overpowers everything, because no matter what you're doing, you will want to be able to die if you lose all your health. Now, you may have more than one death animation, and you may have different death animations for different actions. So, for example, if you're crouching, you may have a different death animation than if you're standing. Or you may have something like ragdoll physics. But at the end of the day, we're still going to want some animation to play, regardless of how we set up our system. So I'm going to click on my transition rule that I have from idle to death. And I am going to go over to this transition rule sharing and press the promote button. This will promote the rule that I have here, which is that character reference is dead, to a shared rule so that we can use it for other states. So right here it says shared transition name. We're going to say death. Now the transition rule sharing, instead of saying use shared, will say death. This means that we can then go from any of our other animations, so reload to death, for example. If we drag reload to death, we'll get a transition rule here. And this transition rule can now have death as the rule, meaning that if the character reference is dead is true, it will go to the dead state. So I don't have to remake this rule every time. I can just use this shared rule. Now, all the other animations, like I said, you may want to be able to do this from. The main one for me is the move, idle, and reload. So I'd recommend that my move to death also has the isDead shared transition rule. Shoot isn't so important to me, because once you're done shooting, you go to the idle, and then you go to death. It is slightly delayed, but if you do want the character to get their shot out before they die, you don't have to cancel out of shoot to death. But you could. And so if you want to do that, you know, it's this simple. Just add a transition rule from shoot to death, go to transition rule sharing, and select the death transition rule. I'm going to leave my crouch alone for now, because we're actually going to do more with that in the series as we go on. But for now, this works. Aim down sight should also have this, just so that we are covering all of our bases. But really, it's not necessary. The main ones are move and idle. If we now play our game, we can walk into our traps again, and this time we will play the death animation as soon as we reach 0 health and die, even though we can still do things like move, look, and shoot. So our animation is playing properly, and our character is stuck in the dead animation. They haven't been able to respawn yet, which is intended for right now. But we need to make sure we disable all the other functionality, all the other things that they can do that we don't want them to do while they are dead. So we can go ahead and close this and go back into the code, and I'm going to start at the top of my FPS tutorial character.cpp. We're going to scroll down, and we're going to go to every single function that we have and block out any logic that we don't want to occur while the character is dead. So I'm skipping my constructor, my begin play, my setup player input component. We don't have to change anything there. On fire. Now this is a function that gets called anytime the button that is bound to the fire action has been pressed. And so this means shooting our weapons, potentially punching, or using some unarmed attack if we don't have a weapon currently. Could do other things as well. It could be firing in a vehicle, like on a turret. We don't want any of that to occur if they have died. If they've died, we want to stop that. So I'm simply going to take everything inside of this function and encompass it within an if statement. So I'm going to go to the very top of the function and check if not, that's an exclamation mark, is dead. If we are not dead, then I'm going to put brackets, and essentially I'm going to delete the end bracket and then put it at the bottom. So I'm going to encompass the entire function, everything we had to this point, in this if statement. So only if we're not dead do we do any of this logic related to firing a weapon or attacking, whatever this case may be. That will stop us from doing all those actions. Now let's start scrolling down. We have start firing, stop firing. On fire is the actual function that gets called to trigger the fire handle, play the sounds, all that good stuff. But start firing and stop firing are also related to button presses. So on firing continues to call itself in the case of an automatic weapon. If we are still holding the button, then on fire is called. Start firing only gets called every time we press the button a new time. So if we press, then release, then press it again, start firing is going to be called twice. But if we press and hold it, start firing will only be called once, but on fire could be called multiple times. Because of this, we also want to make sure that we can't start firing if we are dead. So if not is dead, we can do all of this logic. I'm going to do the same for stop firing as well. It seemed a little bit counterintuitive at first because you're like, well, why does it matter? If we release the button, we can stop firing. Doesn't matter if we're dead because we don't want to be firing anyway. However, be careful. All these buttons that you release and they trigger functions, they could potentially set character states. They could change things on the HUD. They could do all these different actions, and you may not want them to happen when they're dead. So even if it doesn't seem like you need to do it, if I do it for the button press, I'm most likely going to do it for the button release. So for stop firing, we're going to check that same if not is dead. Now on reset VR is a VR function that comes with the first person shooter template that we used. I don't actually need to do this, and you should be able to reset your VR if you're dead anyway, because this is resetting your position to like front and center or the default. So I'm not going to block that one out. Begin touch works for touch controls. If you want, you could block it out, but again, you should be able to touch the screen when you are dead, regardless. I'm not using the VR or the touch controls, but if you are, by all means, just leave them. You shouldn't have to change anything with them. Same with end touch. If the button is released, if the touch controls are released, you should be able to do that even if the character is dead. This has been commented out with the template. That's not something I did, so I'm leaving that alone. Now, move forward. This is our actual movement on our character. So this is what it takes for us to move forward or backward with the direction that we're facing. We definitely don't want to be moving while we're dead, so I'm going to make sure that we check not is dead. And we don't want to do anything related to that if we are dead. Now, same with move right. Move right handles right and left movement on our character. So we're going to make sure that we are not dead before we move right or left. So no movement. That will block out all movement that we have. Then we have tilt right. Now tilting is actually when we go to a corner and we peek around the corner. This is something we did implement, and we shouldn't be able to tilt while we are dead. So I'm going to make sure that everything in tilt right only occurs if we're not dead. This one's kind of a long function, but you just follow it down to the bottom of the function. One before the final bracket, you can add it, and everything will be within inside this if statement. Now the turn at rate and the look up at rate. These are our actual rotations, looking around. I'm going to leave these ones in right now so we can still look around while we are dead. But otherwise, you can just keep them here, leave them alone. Then we have enable touchscreen movement. Again, another touch function, not one we implemented. You can just leave it alone. I have my sprint function. I don't want to be able to sprint while I'm dead. So simply, we check to make sure we're not dead before we allow the character to sprint. Now remember what I said earlier, whenever we have an action that fires on a button press such as sprint, and we have one bound to a release such as stop sprinting, we most likely don't want to do that if we are dead. So in this case, and stop sprinting, I'm going to make sure we're not dead before doing anything in it. I know it's very repetitive, but it's very important. We don't want the character, or really the player, doing things that they shouldn't be able to do after they've died. Zoom in and stop zoom is zooming in with a weapon. Well, we don't want to be able to do that while we're dead, so you can guess what we're going to do by now. Stop zoom is the same way. If we did it for start zoom, then I want to do it for stop zoom. So if not is dead. All right, manual reload. Well, we don't want to be able to trigger a manual reload if we're dead. So here you go. If not is dead. There are other ways to reload instead of manual reload, such as if the player presses the button to fire and the character has run out of ammo in their current weapon, then we'll still call reload weapon. But we don't want to be able to do this either. Even though the fire is blocked right now by being dead, it's still, in my opinion, a good idea to make sure that we just can't reload at all if we're dead. It's just a safeguard. It will not be noticeable in terms of performance to add this one other if check. And now we'll know that the weapon can't be reloaded while the character is dead. Now, calculate ammo is actually okay to leave. Calculate ammo determines how much ammo is left after a reload, or potentially another operation if you want to use it for something else. And so we don't have to actually disable this. This is just gathering data for us. We're not doing anything with it, except for triggering the out of ammo pop-up if we're completely out of ammo. But since we cannot fire, and right now we're not using it anywhere else, I would say leave it alone. Otherwise, this one could get a little bit complicated. For example, if another character comes by and they want to pick up the weapon that this character had, we may want to calculate how much ammo they had remaining, so we could even call it after they've died to get the final count and pass that data along to the weapon on the ground. So I'm leaving this one alone for now. Now I have abilities. These abilities are kind of like Overwatch abilities or Paladin's abilities, where you press a button and then you activate a certain set of abilities. Well, I definitely don't want to be able to use that while I am dead. So if not is dead, we want to make sure that we can use the ability, but otherwise we don't want to use the ability. And same for usability too. Now we also have reset ability 1 and reset ability 2, which these actually happen on timers. Basically, each ability has a duration, and once that duration is reached, the abilities are reset. This one is just based off a timer, so you could die, and then your ability could reset. That's perfectly fine. As long as you can't use the ability, it doesn't really hurt anything. I'm going to leave reset ability 1 and 2 alone. Same with ability 1 and ability 2 cooldown complete, as they just go hand in hand with these reset ability functions. Now, take damage. Take damage I actually don't want to do if we are dead, because if we're dead and we take more damage, it could be pretty weird. Our health could go into the negative. We could be considered killed twice, like if we're already dead and say the opponent was awarded a kill for it, but then they shoot us again while our health is still below 0, so they've killed us again, essentially. So you want to be careful and make sure that doesn't happen. So take damage only if we're not dead. Die, you might as well do it only if you're not dead as well. You don't want to be able to die if you're already dead. So encompass that entire function in there. Now respawn we may be able to do even if we're not dead. So if we are dead, we can respawn, and even if we're not dead, we may be able to force a respawn. So I'm not going to check for if we're dead or not to respawn. Add ammo is for adding that actual ammo type to our inventory. This is probably something we don't want to do if we're dead. Like, for example, if you land on ammo as you die, you'd pick it up. I'm going to disable that so that doesn't happen. Scrolling down to interact. Interact is a pretty big one. We have a lot of logic with interaction, but we don't want to do any interaction logic if we are dead. So we do our simple if not is dead. And make sure you grab everything in the interact function. There we go. Drop weapon. This is how we can switch weapons or just drop it to the ground instead of holding it anymore. Probably don't want to be able to drop our weapons if we're dead unless it is forced, like if we're dead and we drop them on the ground. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to check and make sure we don't drop weapons if we're dead. However, we will update this in the future if we want our loot to drop once we die to have an override that it was forced. Basically, I don't want the player to be able to enable the drop weapon function by pressing a button, but we may want to force dropping a weapon upon defeat. Those are different. So right now I'm going to say we can't drop weapons if we're dead, but that can easily be updated in the future with another or check in this boolean. Now, similar to drop weapon, I don't want to be able to swap weapon with another. So this time I'm just going to make sure if we're not dead, we can swap weapons. Otherwise, let's not allow swapping. Trigger weapon switch. Trigger weapon switch is called when we pick up a new weapon or pick up our first weapon and we automatically want to switch over to that weapon. Again, we shouldn't really do this if we're dead. Switch to next primary weapon. So this is just switching weapons that we are already holding. Don't want to be able to do that if we're dead. Go down to the end of this function. All right, now we are to some more movement functions. We have start crouch. Don't want to begin crouching if we're dead. Problem solved. And stop crouch again. If we were crouching and we died, great. I don't want to necessarily change my state, change my walk speed, any of that stuff when I'm dead. So even if we release the button and we were holding crouch, we just don't want to call stop crouch while we're dead. Enable shield recharge. You could disable this one if you want because this is what allows us to be able to recharge our shields. But you could also just take out the logic for a tick to actually recharge the shields when you're dead. Either way would work. We can be extra safe here, and we can just make sure that this boolean can't be set to true if we're dead. Basically, there's no circumstances where we're dead and we want our shields to recharge, so that's safe to check against. But even with that checked against, we should make sure that we are not adding to our shield, because even if Ken's shield's recharge is true when we've died, we don't want to actually be able to recharge them. Say we died to something that was insta-death. Well, at that point, the shields still think that they can recharge, so why not let them recharge? But we don't actually want them to. We're just going to say the character's dead. Don't worry about it. Tick is a little bit more confusing, though, because Tick has a lot of different things in it. It has interaction as well as the shield charging. I'm still going to do if not is dead for now. However, there will be some things in Tick that we do want to do. In fact, our respawning will be covered using a timer that is tracked by Tick. So we don't necessarily want to block out everything in Tick when we're dead. In fact, a lot of things in Tick will be still going and still valid when we are dead. Right now, this is our shield charging, which we don't want to do that if we're dead. And this is our collision channels for looking at objects or overlapping with an object and allowing us to interact with them. However, I don't care about any of that because we're not allowing interaction when we are dead anyway. So right now I can block out everything. If we're dead, don't do it in Tick. But remember, that won't always be the case. And if you've gone and done other things in your series and in your game, you may not want to block everything in Tick. So be careful with this one. That's the last function we have in here. So now we are finally ready to test it out. So I'm going to relaunch this and I'll catch up with you when the editor is open. Alright, the engine is back open, so now when I come into the game, I can go and hit my traps again. Eventually I will die. And you'll see I am able to look around. That's working as intended. I cannot shoot, I cannot sprint, I cannot aim down sights, I cannot use my abilities. So everything is pretty much working as intended. There is one thing I can do, however, that I would like to stop, and that is the jumping. So I can jump. Even though we went through all of our functions, I can still jump. We have never overwritten the jump function in our FPS tutorial character.h, and thus we never checked to see if we were dead or not before performing the jump function. We can go ahead and do that now. The jump function already exists as far as the character class goes, which is the parent class to our FPS tutorial character. We'll go right to the tick function, because the tick is also an override. So here's our tick function. You can see that we overrode the tick function, so now we can do the same thing to the jump function. So we can do virtual void jump override. Now jump is a function within the A character class, which is the parent of our FPS tutorial character. So by default, we do the standard jump logic. However, if we go into our FPS tutorial character, and I'll go right above the tick function again, we can do void a FPS tutorial character jump. And this will allow us to do our own logic when we perform the jump action. What we should really do here is call super jump. This will allow us to do the logic that we do in the parent class within the child class, but then we can go on and to expand in other lines. Like if we wanted to say, is jumping equals true? I don't have this variable, it's just an example that I'm giving. But now we can do everything in the parent class while adding our own logic to it later. Right now we don't have to do anything else after it, but we only want to call the jump function if we are not dead. So now, if we go ahead and launch our game one more time, you'll notice that we won't be able to jump unless we are alive. Alright, editor is back open again, and you can see I can jump now, so that worked as intended. Let's see what happens when we die. So here we are in our death animation, and at this point, anytime I press the space button, I will not be able to jump. Anyway guys, that's all I got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video on how to die and how to be defeated. If you did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I also want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for all the love and support. I really appreciate it, and it really makes this series a joy to work on, so thank you so much. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I will be happy to assist you and get you sorted with any problems that you had. Otherwise, guys, like I said, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.